What we've been talking about in the last couple of months is what happened from 1776 into the following decades, what was happening to expand or not expand the certain unalienable rights to Americans wherever they were. So tonight we're just going to take a vignette. It's about 2 years, but it frankly was a warm-up for the Civil War, which all of us hear something about in school. I assume everybody here has heard something about the American Civil War. It was, in terms of American casualties, it was the most tragic war, and it was all fought on our soil. It was a civil war of the first order. But it was also revolutionary in certain respects, politically and economically, and we'll talk about that later on. But where we are right now is 1854, real close. Civil War started in 1861, and after several decades in Congress, where the battle between North and South was happening in polite words and euphemisms for slave and free labor, talking about popular sovereignty and states' rights and so forth, there was an outbreak in a territory just a ways west of us and slightly south, and that was the Kansas-Nebraska territory. Actually, Nebraska would be slightly north. And why did that happen? Well, that was from the beginning of our republic in the 1770s, what was considered to be the far west. It was the Great West. In some years, it was called the Great Desert. It was an area that we didn't know that much about. It was everything west of the Mississippi. It was what we carved up eventually. It included some land that we got from Mexico in the Mexican War, but it also included all of Louisiana Purchase, which we got in 1803. It nearly doubled the size of what we knew at the time to be the United States, and it was wide open. Through some policies that I'm not going to go into tonight, but there were a lot of Native Americans living on this turf. A lot of them were pushed out to the west edge of this particular area, the Kansas-Nebraska area. And in that void of settlement, a number of families moved west. It took about 30 years. More of them were from the south than from the north, and quite a few of the southern squatters that went out there brought slaves with them. Therein lay the problem from a national perspective, because what it did was upset the compromise that was made in 1820 to settle for all time the boundary between north and south, slave and free, thinking that the slavery in this country would eventually die out because it couldn't keep expanding. As that territory was being organized, and ultimately as the state of Kansas was created, we had to deal with a new act by Congress, which basically eliminated or made null and void the Missouri Compromise. So then all of a sudden things are wide open. That led to open warfare in Kansas, Nebraska. There are a lot of amateurs, some state militia, mostly just farmers who taking up arms to protect some land that they've just recently started to farm, and then also others who had slaves and also taking up land to protect themselves. It broke out into absolute warfare in 1854. Both sides of the question on slavery were trying to organize a constitution, battling each other, and it broke out in the streets and the towns of that territory. Hundreds of people were killed. By 1856, two particular things were known across the country. They blazed across newspapers in the East. One was probably the first blow of what would later be the Civil War. Pro-slavery forces actually burned the town of Lawrence, which was the biggest town in Kansas at the time, where mostly people were there who were sort of trying to maintain an anti-slavery position. And in response to that, a fellow named John Brown, who you may have heard of, made his first splash on the national political scene. He led a couple of dozen people in the night to a small town on Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas and slaughtered 5 households as they slept and rode off. Talk about polarization. Things were not only polarized politically, but there wasn't the same kind of a bridge between people of different political persuasions trying to find what right and wrong was. And so, while that's going on nationally, there's a political realignment going on. The Democrats in the North no longer could compete in the sense that they were, many of them anti-slavery, but the strongest part of the Democratic Party was in the South, and that was obviously pro-slavery. And as the Democratic Party in the North was fading, a new party was organized, and it was called the Republican Party. And it was organized first in Ripon, Wisconsin, and one of the earliest proponents of that party was this guy named Lincoln. And Lincoln and others in Illinois and the upper Midwest were key in trying to organize votes in the election of 1856. They actually came up with 100 seats in Congress, which if you look back over minority parties in the last 150 years, that was big. They ran a presidential candidate, a guy named John C. Fremont, who up to that point was kind of an adventurer, got breveted as a general, and supposedly discovered Pikes Peak. But after that, not a lot to say for the man. But he lost to the Democrat, a guy named Buchanan, who won the presidency that year. But I would say that Mr. Lincoln, at that point, was not going to be lost. We will come into Mr. Lincoln and then a guy who stood for the Democratic Party's rejection of the Missouri Compromise, a guy named Stephen Douglas, in the next meeting. But here's what Lincoln said in 1856. He said, "Our Republican robe has been trailed in the dust." And he calls on his fellow Americans of any party to repurify it, to turn and wash it in the spirit, if not the blood, of the Revolution and the Declaration. Let us readopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it, the practices and policy which harmonize with it. If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, but we will have so saved it as to make it and to keep it forever worthy of the saving. More from Mr. Lincoln as we get closer to June.